Most of us probably hate being vulnerable. We hate being vulnerable with people. We probably don't even really like being vulnerable with God. I think there's a good song that kind of highlights that theme, the difficulty of being vulnerable. It's a song by a band called the Oh Hellos. And they have a song that says, "Hello, my old heart, how have you been? How is it being locked away?" And as you listen to the lyrics of the song, you find that the person who's speaking has experienced heartbreak in their life. And they've discovered that it's just easier to keep their heart locked up, to not be vulnerable, because when you're vulnerable, you risk being hurt. And that's a scary thing. And yet, if we ever find ourselves in a situation, if we're not being vulnerable, then we're not really able to love well. The heart isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing if we're not being vulnerable. There's a great quote from a book called Heart of the World by von Balthasar. And he's kind of opening up that theme a little bit by talking about the heart itself, like the organ, the heart. And he gives us this analogy with the heart. He says, what heart can protect itself? It wouldn't be a heart at all if it were armored and jacketed. It would not be a heart if it did not gape wide and make itself defenseless to the stream rushing in. If it did not dispense life from its own exhaustible store of life, forgetting all else for the sheer glee of such lavish squandering. So the image he's giving us is the heart having to pump blood through the body is always completely, perfectly open, completely vulnerable to the rush of blood coming in, the rush of life coming in. And because of that vulnerability, it is able to be generous and to give out the other side of the heart. And so he's making the point that it's the same for us. As we abandon ourselves to the gift of love, as we abandon ourselves in vulnerability to the other, then we're able to give generously as well. That's a really high calling. That is hard to live. It's hard to be vulnerable with others because we could get hurt. It's hard to be vulnerable with God because we have to push through all sorts of lies in our life. We have to push through the lie that God doesn't care, or that God won't answer us, or maybe even the lie that God doesn't even really love us. And so the beginning of developing vulnerability is just, first of all, noticing what's going on in our heart. What are our thoughts? What are our feelings? What are our desires? If we can name them, then we can present them to God and just kind of tell him, this is what's going on in my heart. It's the heart to heart. It's letting the Lord in to the places that are difficult, the thoughts, the feelings, and the desires that maybe no one else really knows. And we invite the Lord in, and then it requires that extra step of vulnerability to wait on God's answer, which might take a little bit of time. We might have to sit there for a little while to receive his peace, to receive his gentleness, receive his love. But it is so worth it. As we abandon ourselves to the rush coming in, then we get to experience the joy of giving love. If we really struggle with this, it's good to remember that God was vulnerable with us first. I love the painting of the Sacred Heart. There's lots of different paintings out there, but I think of the traditional one you often see in maybe people's homes, this image of Jesus holding the organ of his heart, maybe a little flame coming out the top, and he's just holding it with this gentle look on his face, almost like he's offering it to the person looking at this painting, making the point that Jesus offers his heart to us. He offers his heart to the world. He loves us. He died for us. And in offering us his heart, he was taking a risk, the risk that we might not love him back. We might not be grateful for the gift of his sacrifice on the cross. That was a risk. But he gives us the example that that's what vulnerability looks like. And we see the fruits of his vulnerability, the life that he brought to the world through his vulnerability. So he's setting the example for us that if we're vulnerable as well, if we let the Lord in, and if we let people into our hearts, then we can be generous as well. When we open ourselves to the inexhaustible rush of God's love, then we can love generously as well. God bless you.